In the history of warfare, survival is usually about distance. You survive by being far away from the bullet. You survive by ducking away from the shell. You survive by running away from the grenade. But on a freezing night in 1917, in the deadliest sector of the Western Front, a Scottish soldier named John Carmichael did the opposite. He didn't run away from the bomb, he trapped it. The engineers who designed his equipment said it was impossible. They said his helmet, a thin piece of pressed steel, was designed to stop shrapnel from the sky, not a volcano from the ground. They said if a grenade exploded underneath it, the steel would shatter like glass and turn into a shotgun blast that would kill everyone in the trench. But John Carmichael had a theory born of desperation, a theory that required him to do the most unnatural thing a human being can do, to stand on top of death. They called the helmet a soup bowl. They laughed at it, but after that night, nobody laughed at the tin hat ever again. But before we descend into the trenches, smash that like button to help us dig our way out of the algorithm. Subscribe and ring the bell, it's the only signal we have on the front line. And comment down below, if you had 4 seconds to live, what is the last thing you would say? Now, let's go to Passchendaele. September 1917. The Ypres salient, Belgium. If hell has a waiting room, it looks like Passchendaele. World War I was already 3 years old. The optimism of 1914 was dead. The maneuvering of 1915 was gone. By 1917, the war had devolved into a meat grinder. The Ypres salient was a bulge in the Allied line, surrounded on 3 sides by German artillery. But the enemy wasn't just the Germans, it was the weather. It had been raining for weeks. The shelling had destroyed the drainage canals of Flanders. The water had nowhere to go. The battlefield was a swamp of liquid mud. It was so deep that if a man slipped off the wooden duckboards, he could sink up to his waist. If he was carrying a heavy pack, he could sink over his head and drown in the earth. The smell was indescribable. It was a mixture of cordite, rotting vegetation, chloride of lime, and thousands of unburied bodies churning in the sludge. This was the world of the North Staffordshire Regiment. They were living like rats. They slept in holes carved out of the wet clay. They were constantly wet, constantly cold, and constantly terrified. Among them was Sergeant John Carmichael. He was 24 years old, a Scotsman from Lanarkshire. He wasn't a Rambo-style action hero. He was a quiet man, a former laborer. He had strong hands and a calm demeanor. In the chaos of the trenches, calm was the most valuable commodity. When the shells were falling, the men looked to Carmichael. If the sergeant wasn't panicking, maybe they didn't need to panic either. But Carmichael was worried. They were occupying a sector near Hill 60. It was a notorious kill zone. The trenches were narrow, barely wide enough for 2 men to pass, and they were about to get narrower. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand the equipment, specifically the helmet. In 1914, soldiers went to war wearing cloth caps. This was a disaster. The air was filled with shrapnel raining down from above. Head injuries were the #1 cause of death. So the British Army introduced the Brodie helmet. The Americans called it the Doughboy helmet. The British called it the tin hat. It was a simple design, a single sheet of steel pressed into a soup bowl shape with a wide brim. It was designed for one thing: shrapnel from above. If a shell exploded in the air, the brim would protect the soldier's neck and shoulders. But the soldiers hated it. It was uncomfortable, it wobbled when you ran, it was cold in the winter and hot in the summer. It looked ridiculous. "It looks like a wok," one soldier joked. "It's good for washing your socks in," said another, "or cooking stew." Engineers and officers constantly lectured the men. "This is a ballistic shield, treat it with respect." But the men treated it like a multi-purpose bucket. They sat on it, they bailed water with it, they played cards on it. And there was one thing every engineer agreed on. The helmet was not a containment chamber. The steel was relatively thin. It was meant to deflect glancing blows.
It was not designed to contain the pressure of high explosives. If you put a grenade inside a helmet, the physics were terrifying. The explosion would have nowhere to go. The pressure would build up instantly, and the steel would fragment. Instead of stopping shrapnel, the helmet would become the shrapnel. It was widely accepted wisdom. If a grenade falls in the trench, you run around the corner. You don't try to cover it. Covering it was suicide.
The other player in this drama was the Mills Bomb No. 5, the standard British hand grenade. It was a segmented cast iron pineapple. It was heavy. It felt like a rock in your hand. Inside, it was packed with baratol explosive. The design was brutal. When it exploded, the cast iron casing would shatter into hundreds of jagged metal fragments. These fragments traveled at the speed of a bullet. The kill radius was about 10 yards. In an open field, you might survive if you lay flat. But a trench isn't an open field. A trench is a confined space. It is a tube with dirt walls. If a grenade goes off in a trench, the shock wave is channeled. It bounces off the walls. The pressure is magnified. The shrapnel doesn't fly away, it ricochets. A single grenade in a sap, a digging tunnel, means death for everyone inside. The fuse on the Mills bomb was officially 4 seconds, but in the damp, freezing mud of Passchendaele, fuses were unpredictable. Sometimes it was 4 seconds, sometimes it was 3, sometimes it was 7. Once the pin was pulled and the lever flew off, you were holding a live volcano.
September 8, 1917, nightfall. The order came down to the 9th Battalion. We need to extend the trench. This was the worst job in the Army, sapping. It meant digging a new tunnel perpendicular to the main trench, usually toward the enemy lines. It was quiet work. You couldn't use picks because the noise would alert the German listening posts. You had to use spades. You had to be silent. Sergeant Carmichael took a small detail of men. They moved to the end of the trench line. It was a T-head, a dead end. The mud was waist-deep. The walls of the trench were crumbling. They were cold. Their hands were numb. Carmichael organized the men. "Keep it quiet," he whispered. "One man digs, one man fills the sandbags." The space was claustrophobic. The trench was barely 3 feet wide. 5 men were crammed into the end of the sap. Carmichael was supervising. He was watching the trench traverse, making sure no German raiders surprised them. One of the men was cleaning his equipment. In the dark, fumbling with numb fingers, he reached for a grenade on his belt. Perhaps the pin was already loose. Perhaps it caught on a piece of webbing. Perhaps the mud had corroded the safety loop. It doesn't matter how it happened. What matters is the sound. Ping. The sound of the striker lever flying off. The sound of the primer igniting. Hiss. Every soldier knows that sound. It cuts through the noise of the rain. It cuts through the exhaustion. It triggers a primal response in the brain. The grenade dropped. It didn't land in the mud. It landed on the duckboard, the wooden slats at the bottom of the trench. It rolled. It hit Carmichael's boot. Time stopped. This is not a figure of speech. In high adrenaline situations, the brain processes information faster, making the world appear to move in slow motion. This is called tachypsychia. Carmichael looked down. He saw the Mills bomb. Smoke was already curling from the fuse. He did the math instantly. Option 1, pick it up and throw it. Problem, they were in a T-head. If he threw it forward, it would hit the parapet and roll back. If he threw it backward, it would land in the main trench where the rest of the platoon was sleeping. If he threw it straight up, it would airburst over their heads and kill them all. Also, the fuse had already been burning for maybe 1 second. By the time he bent down, grabbed it, and cocked his arm, boom, it would explode in his hand, taking his head off. Option 2, run. Problem, the mud. It was sticky clay. You couldn't run. You could barely walk. And there were 5 men behind him in the dead end. If Carmichael ran, he would be trampling his own men. The grenade would explode behind him, and the shock wave would liquefy their internal organs in the confined space. There was no way out. The grenade was going to kill them, unless he changed the physics of the explosion, unless he smothered it.
But with what? His body? If he threw his body on it, he would die. That's a noble sacrifice, but Carmichael didn't want to die. He wanted to survive. He needed a shield. He looked at his head. He took off his steel helmet, the soup bowl, the hated tin hat. The engineers said it couldn't contain a blast. But Carmichael wasn't an engineer. He was a miner. He understood pressure. If he could trap the blast for just a millisecond, if he could force the explosion down into the mud instead of up into the air, he shouted one word to his men: "Back!"
The men scrambled back, slipping and sliding in the muck. Carmichael didn't move back. He moved forward. He dropped the helmet over the grenade. It clattered against the duckboard. The smoke was trapped underneath. But a helmet weighs only 1.3 pounds. The force of the explosion would simply flip the helmet over like a tiddlywink, and the shrapnel would fly out anyway. The helmet needed weight on top of it, heavy weight. Carmichael stepped onto the helmet. He placed his left foot directly on the crown of the steel dome. He put his full weight on it. He stood there, balancing on the metal curve, like a man standing on a landmine. He closed his eyes. He gritted his teeth. He waited. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Boom! The moment of detonation. In a standard explosion, energy travels the path of least resistance. When a Mills bomb explodes in open air, the casing shatters and the energy expands in a sphere, 360 degrees of death. But John Carmichael had changed the geometry of the battlefield. By placing the helmet over the grenade, he created a containment vessel. By standing on the helmet, he added mass and downward pressure to the equation. When the Baratol exploded, the pressure inside the helmet spiked to thousands of pounds per square inch in a microsecond. The steel of the Brody helmet was strong, but not infinite. It began to deform. It bulged outward, but it didn't disintegrate instantly. For a fraction of a second, a crucial, life-saving millisecond, the steel held the blast in check. The helmet acted like the nozzle of a rocket engine, but in reverse. Unable to go up, blocked by the steel and Carmichael's weight, and unable to go out, blocked by the rim of the helmet pressing into the mud, the blast was forced down. It hammered into the wooden duckboard. It pulverized the wood. It smashed into the wet clay beneath. Then the helmet failed. The steel shattered. The rim sheared off. The force of the explosion finally overcame Carmichael's weight. It didn't just push him, it launched him. The men cowering around the corner described the sound not as a sharp crack of a grenade, but as a dull, thumping whump, like a heavy door slamming shut in a cellar. Mud, wood splinters, and twisted steel sprayed the trench walls. Smoke filled the sap instantly. Then silence, the ringing silence that follows a concussion. The soldiers in the main trench scrambled to their feet. Sarge? John? They expected to find a corpse. In the brutal logic of trench warfare, a man standing on a grenade doesn't leave a body to bury. He leaves a memory. They crept forward into the smoke, their bayonets ready, eyes watering from the fumes. They found the end of the sap. The trench walls were scarred. The wooden floor was obliterated, replaced by a smoking crater of black mud. And lying on his back, blown clear out of the sap and onto the parados, the rear bank of the trench, was Sergeant Carmichael. He was alive. He was conscious. He was groaning, his face gray with shock, his teeth clenched so hard they looked like they might crack. "Stay back," he rasped. "Is everyone clear?" The men froze. He had just eaten a grenade, and his first question was about them? "We're good, Sarge. We're clear." They rushed to him. His tunic was shredded, his face was blackened with soot, but his torso, the vital organs, the heart, the lungs, was intact. The helmet had done its job. It had shielded his core from the fragmentation. The explosion hadn't ripped through his chest, it had traveled down. But the energy had to go somewhere. It had gone into his legs. It had gone into his feet. The men looked down at his boots, or what was left of them. It was a ruin. The bones were shattered. The boots were shredded leather and blood.
The blast had driven the steel of the helmet into the ground, but the recoil had hammered his legs with the force of a sledgehammer swing from a giant. He wasn't dead, but he was broken.
In modern medicine, we talk about the golden hour, the critical 60 minutes after an injury where survival is decided. In Passchendaele, there was no golden hour. There was the muddy eternity. Carmichael was bleeding. He was in agony, but he was in the middle of a waist-deep swamp, in a trench line that was under constant German artillery fire. "Get a stretcher," someone yelled. "Stretcher's no good here," another soldier argued. "The corners are too tight." They had to improvise. They grabbed a waterproof poncho. They rolled Carmichael onto it. He screamed once, a short, sharp sound, as his shattered legs moved. Then he went silent again. The shock was setting in. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the cold, dull throb of trauma. 4 men grabbed the corners of the poncho. "Lift on 3. 1, 2, 3. They hoisted him up. They began the Passchendaele shuffle. If you have never walked in deep mud, imagine walking through peanut butter. Now imagine doing it while carrying a 180-pound man. Now imagine doing it while bullets snap overhead like angry hornets. They slipped. They slid. Every time a bearer stumbled, Carmichael jolted. He bit his lip until blood ran down his chin, refusing to cry out. He knew that if he panicked, his men would panic. They carried him back through the communication trenches, past the support lines, past the reserve lines. It took 2 hours to move him 1 mile. They finally reached the regimental aid post, RAP. It was a dugout reinforced with sandbags and timber. The medical officer, M.O., was a tired man with bloodshot eyes and an apron that looked like a butcher's. "What do we have?" the M.O. asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Grenade, sir," the stretcher-bearer said, breathless. He stood on it. The M.O. stopped. He looked at the bearer. "He what?" "He stood on it, sir, put his helmet over it and stood on it." The M.O. looked down at Carmichael. Carmichael looked back, his eyes glassy with morphine but lucid. "Is that true, Sergeant?" the M.O. asked. "It was the only way, sir," Carmichael whispered. "No room to throw it." The M.O. cut away the boots. He cut away the trousers. He winced. The damage was severe. Compound fractures, massive soft tissue damage, shrapnel embedded deep in the muscle. But his femoral arteries were intact. His abdomen was unperforated. The M.O. shook his head in disbelief. By all the laws of medicine and ballistics, this man should be a red mist in a trench. Instead, he was a patient with 2 broken legs. "You're a lucky man, Sergeant," the M.O. said, tying off a tourniquet, "or a mad one. I haven't decided which." "Did the helmet survive?" Carmichael asked. The bearer reached into his webbing. He pulled out a piece of jagged, twisted metal. It was unrecognizable as a helmet. It looked like a piece of abstract art made of violence. "This is all we found, Sarge." Carmichael looked at the scrap of steel, the soup bowl, the useless tin hat. It had just paid for itself 1,000 times over. The news traveled faster than the stretcher. By the time Carmichael reached the casualty clearing station at Bailleul, the story was already circulating. The man who stifled a grenade, the human sandbag. Officers from other battalions came to the hospital tent just to look at him. General Hugh Bruce Williams, the commander of the division, came to his bedside. The general was a stiff-lipped aristocrat, not given to emotion, but he stood by Carmichael's cot and took his hat off. "Sergeant," the general said, "that was the bravest thing I have ever heard of." Carmichael, groggy from the surgery, shifted in his bed. "I didn't think I was doing anything extraordinary, sir," he said. "I just knew the boys couldn't get away." "I didn't think I was doing anything extraordinary." That sentence would appear in the newspapers back home. It would be printed on cigarette cards. But for now, the reality was pain. The doctors worked for hours to save his legs. They picked out the metal. They set the bones. They told him he might never walk again. But he was alive.
Back in the trench, the 5 men who had been in the sap with him were alive too. They sat in the dugout, drinking tea with shaking hands. They looked at the empty space where Carmichael had been. "He saved us," one of them said. "He actually saved us." They wrote a letter to his mother in Scotland. They didn't tell her about the gore. They didn't tell her about the mud. They just told her that her son was the reason they were going to see the sun come up tomorrow.
Word of the incident reached the War Office in London. The engineers and the ballistics experts were baffled. They pulled the specs for the Mark I Brodie helmet. Material: Hadfield manganese steel. Thickness: 0.036 inches. Tensile strength: high impact resistance, low blast containment. They ran calculations. If a Mills bomb exerts X amount of pressure, the helmet should have failed instantly. Why didn't it? They realized that Carmichael had inadvertently discovered a principle of blast deflection. By standing on the helmet, he hadn't just sealed it. He had created a tamped explosion. The mud of the trench floor was soft, Passchendaele mud. The helmet was hard. The explosion, looking for a way out, had driven the helmet down into the soft mud before the steel ruptured. The mud had absorbed a massive amount of the kinetic energy. The earth took the hit, so the man didn't have to. It was a perfect storm of variables: the mud, the steel, the weight of the man, the angle of the boot. If any one of those things had been different, if the ground had been concrete, if he had used a sandbag instead of a helmet, if he had hesitated for half a second, he would be dead. The stupid helmet, mocked for looking like a salad bowl, had a shape that was unintentionally perfect for smothering a blast. Its dome shape distributed the pressure evenly before failing. It was an accidental miracle of engineering. But miracles usually come with a medal attached, and John Carmichael was about to get the big one.
October 1917. Crossing the Channel. The war has a smell. It is the smell of wet wool, stale tobacco, infection, and coal smoke. John Carmichael lay on a stretcher on the deck of a hospital ship crossing the English Channel. Behind him, the rumble of the artillery at Passchendaele was finally fading, replaced by the sound of seagulls and the slap of waves against the hull. He was going to Blighty, home. For millions of men in the trenches, a Blighty wound, a wound serious enough to get you sent home, but not serious enough to kill you, was the ultimate prize. It was the winning lottery ticket. Carmichael had won the lottery, but he had paid for the ticket with his legs. He looked down at the blankets covering his lower body. They were flat. His feet were heavily bandaged, encased in plaster casts. The pain was a constant companion, a dull, throbbing baseline to the rest of his thoughts. But he was breathing. He watched the white cliffs of Dover emerge from the mist. He thought about the sap. He thought about the fuse. It felt like a dream, a nightmare that had happened to someone else.
London, the hospital. The contrast was jarring. 1 week ago, he was living in a hole in the ground, covered in lice and clay. Now he was in a ward with high ceilings, polished linoleum floors, and crisp white sheets. Nurses in starched uniforms moved silently between the beds. But Carmichael wasn't just another patient. The story had preceded him. The nurses whispered when they changed his dressings. "That's the one," they would say. "That's the one who stood on the bomb." He received visitors he didn't know, journalists with notebooks, local politicians looking for a photo op. They asked him the same question: "What were you thinking?" "I wasn't thinking," he would tell them, his voice quiet. "I was doing." But the doctors were focused on something else: his mobility. The blast had shattered the bones in his feet and lower legs. The reconstructive surgery was primitive by modern standards. They used metal pins and wires. "You may walk with a cane, Sergeant," the surgeon told him, "but your marching days are over." Carmichael didn't care about marching. He cared that he still had feet to put into shoes. He spent months in physical therapy, learning to stand, learning to bear weight. The first time he stood up, sweat poured down his face.
The nerves in his feet screamed, but he stood. He was a man who had stood on a grenade. Standing on a floor was nothing compared to that.
February 1918, Buckingham Palace. The telegram arrived on official stationery. His Majesty the King commands the Victoria Cross. It is the highest military decoration awarded for valor in the face of the enemy to members of the armed forces of the British Empire. It is made of bronze, not gold. Legend says the bronze is taken from the melted-down cannons captured from the Russians at the siege of Sevastopol. It is a dark, unpretentious metal. It simply says, "For valor." Carmichael stood in the courtyard of Buckingham Palace. He was wearing his dress uniform. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, hiding the scars underneath. He stood stiffly, leaning slightly on his good leg, trying not to limp. King George V approached him. The king was a bearded, serious man. He had pinned thousands of medals on thousands of chests. But he paused at Carmichael. The citation was read aloud. For most conspicuous bravery, by placing his steel helmet over a grenade and standing on it, he undoubtedly saved the lives of his comrades. The king pinned the bronze cross onto Carmichael's chest. He looked the sergeant in the eye. "Your helmet," the king said. "It was a standard issue?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "Remarkable," the king murmured. "Simply remarkable." The king shook his hand. Carmichael saluted. He walked away. The pain in his legs was sharp with every step, but he didn't show it. Not here, not in front of the king. The medal was nice, the applause was nice, but the real reward came in the mail. Letters, dozens of them, from the mothers of the men who had been in the trench. "Thank you for giving me my son back. Thank you for saving my husband." And letters from the men themselves. They were still out there, still in the mud, still fighting the war that Carmichael had escaped. "We miss you, Sarge," they wrote. "The new sergeant isn't half as steady as you. We tell the new recruits about you. They don't believe us. We show them the spot where the duckboard is smashed." Carmichael read the letters in his hospital bed in Glasgow. He kept them in a small wooden box. To him, these scraps of paper were worth more than the bronze cross. The cross was for him. The letters were proof that his action had mattered, that 5 men were still breathing, eating, laughing, and living because of that 1 second of decision. 1919. The war ends. The guns finally fell silent. The world tried to go back to normal. John Carmichael returned to civilian life. He didn't capitalize on his fame. He didn't write a book. He didn't go on a speaking tour. He went back to Scotland. He worked. He married, he lived, but the war never really left him. The damp weather made his legs ache. Loud noises, a car backfiring, a door slamming, made him flinch. He kept the Victoria Cross in a drawer. He only took it out for Armistice Day parades. When people asked him about it, he would shrug. "It was just a hat," he would say with a smile, "a sturdy hat." But in the engineering schools of the British Army, the story of John Carmichael was being taught as a case study. It changed the way they looked at equipment. It proved that improvisation was a valid tactical doctrine. It taught young officers that sometimes the manual is wrong. The manual said, "Run from the grenade." Carmichael proved, "Control the grenade." Decades later, in World War II, the helmet design changed. The Brodie helmet was eventually replaced by deeper, better helmets, but the lesson remained. In 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, American soldiers were taught to dive on grenades if they couldn't throw them back. They were taught that the human body and the helmet could contain the blast. It became a supreme act of sacrifice. But Carmichael was the pioneer. He was the proof of concept. He was the man who showed the world that a piece of stamped steel, worth a few shillings, could defeat a weapon designed to kill a platoon. He lived to be an old man. He died in 1977 at the age of 84. He died peacefully in his bed, surrounded by family. A family that existed only because he had survived that night in Passchendaele. When they buried him, they didn't bury the medal with him. That went to a museum.
But if you looked at his legs, even at the end, you could still see the scars, the jagged silver lines, the autograph of the Mills bomb, the signature of the war. And somewhere in the fields of Flanders, buried deep in the mud, is a piece of twisted, rusted steel, a helmet that did the impossible.
Why did he do it? It is the question that haunts every study of heroism. Evolutionary biology teaches us one fundamental rule: survive. When a threat appears, a saber-toothed tiger, a falling rock, a burning fuse, the amygdala in the brain screams a single command: run. Self-preservation is the oldest instinct in our DNA. So, how do you explain John Carmichael? How do you explain the split-second decision to override millions of years of evolution? To move toward the fire? Psychologists call it altruistic suicide, though in Carmichael's case, it was altruistic risk. It is a phenomenon often seen in close-knit combat units. The band of brothers isn't just a slogan, it's a psychological state. In the trenches, the self dissolves. The unit becomes the organism. Carmichael didn't see himself as an individual. He saw himself as the shield of the organism. If the grenade exploded, the organism, the squad, would die. Therefore, the grenade had to be stopped. It wasn't a calculation of, I will be a hero. It was a calculation of, this needs to be fixed. It was the same instinct that makes a mother lift a car off her child. The brain shuts down the fear center and engages the action center. But Carmichael had something else. He had situational awareness. He didn't just jump on it blindly. That would have killed him. He used a tool. He improvised. In that 1 second, his brain processed the physics of the helmet, the density of the mud, and the geometry of the trench. It was a flash of genius amidst the terror.
Carmichael was not the only one. Throughout the history of warfare, the grenade jump has become the ultimate symbol of valor. In World War II, Jack Lucas, the 17-year-old Marine we mentioned earlier, did it at Iwo Jima. In Vietnam, Milton Olive III did it. In Iraq, Jason Dunham did it. In Afghanistan, Kyle Carpenter did it. They are a unique brotherhood, the men who hugged the bomb. Most of them did not survive. The explosion of a modern grenade is far more powerful than the crude Mills bomb of 1917. The modern kill radius is larger. The explosive velocity is higher. Those who do it today almost always pay the ultimate price. But Carmichael stands apart because of the outcome. He is one of the very few who stood on the dragon and walked away. He proves that sometimes, against all odds, you can beat the Reaper. He proves that the universe sometimes blinks. His story offers a glimmer of hope in the grim history of war. It tells soldiers it is possible. It tells them that armor works, that quick thinking works, that you are not helpless. Present day, the Ypres salient. The trenches are gone now. Most of them have been plowed over by farmers. The land has been reclaimed. Cows graze where men once drowned in mud. The iron harvest still continues. Every year, farmers dig up tons of unexploded shells and rusted rifles. But if you go to the site of Hill 60 today, the ground is still scarred. There are craters that will never fill in. The earth there is lumpy, unnatural. It remembers. If you stand there in the rain, you can almost feel the ghosts. You can imagine the smell of the cordite. You can hear the ping of the spoon flying off. And you can imagine a young Scotsman, terrified and cold, looking down at a sizzling iron pineapple. You can see him making the choice that would define his life. Not to run, not to hide, but to step forward. John Carmichael was not a super soldier. He wasn't 6'5" with muscles like steel cables. He was a regular guy, a miner, a laborer. He was afraid of the dark. He felt the cold. He missed his mum. But on September 8, 1917, he became a giant. He showed us that the most powerful weapon on the battlefield isn't the machine gun.
It isn't the artillery shell. It is the human spirit. The engineers said the helmet would fail. The doctors said the man would die. The odds said it was impossible. But John Carmichael didn't care about the odds. He put his boot on the helmet, gritted his teeth, and stood his ground. And when the smoke cleared, he was still there. They laughed at the tin hat. They called it a soup bowl. But on that night, it was the strongest shield on Earth.